today's video is going to be looking at some psychological theories that are going to be important moving forward, really looking at cognitive, social, and moral psychological theories. I want to start with talking about constructivism. So the first person that I want to talk about very briefly is John Dewey, who was one of the first who is widely credited with incorporating psychology into teaching and learning. John Dewey believed that learning was active and schooling unnecessarily long and restrictive, and he rejected the notion that schools should focus on repetitive rote memorization and a proposed method of directed living. So like direct instruction, in other words. His idea was that children came to school to do things and live in a community which gave them real guided experiences, which fostered their capacity to contribute to society. In school, students would engage in real-world practical workshops in which they would demonstrate their knowledge through creativity and collaboration. Students should be provided with opportunities to think for themselves and articulate their own thoughts. Dewey called for education to be grounded in real-life experience. Jean Piaget was deeply rooted in classical antiquity, Socratic seminars, dialogue with his followers. He believed in a dialogue with children and asked directed questions that led his students to realize for themselves the weaknesses in thinking, sort of like a Socratic seminar type of situation. He also believed that learning is an active and not a passive process where knowledge should be constructed and not acquired. Knowledge construction is based on personal experiences and the continual testing of hypotheses. Each person has a different interpretation and construction of the knowledge process based on past experience and cultural factors, and so it can vary. Apart from his learning theories, Piaget's theory of constructivism addresses how learning actually occurs and does not only focus on what influences learning. Piaget's theory of constructivism argues that people produce knowledge and form meaning based on their experiences. Piaget's theory covered learning theories, teaching methods, and educational reform. Two key components which create the construction of an individual's new knowledge are assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation causes an individual to incorporate new experiences into old experiences. This causes the individual to develop new outlooks, rethink what was once misunderstandings, and evaluate what is important, ultimately altering their perceptions. Accommodation, other developmental theorists called it restructuring, is reframing the world and new experiences into the mental capacity already present. Individuals conceive a particular fashion in which the world operates. When things do not operate within that context, they must accommodate or reframe the expectations with the outcomes. The role of teachers is very important. Instead of giving a lecture, teachers in this theory function as facilitators whose role is to aid the student when it comes to their own learning. This takes away focus from the teacher and lecture and puts it upon the student and their learning. Resources and lesson plans that must be initiated for this learning theory take a very different approach towards traditional learning as well. Instead of telling, the teacher must begin asking. Instead of answering questions that only align with their curriculum, the facilitator in this case must make it so that the student comes to the conclusions on their own instead of being told. Also, teachers who are continually in conversations with students, creating their learning experience that is open to new directions, depending upon the needs of the student as the learning progresses. Teachers following Piaget's theory of constructivism must challenge the student by making them effective critical thinkers and not merely by being a teacher, but also a mentor, a consultant, and a coach. So in this image, we kind of can see sort of a visual representation of the differences between assimilation and accommodation. In assimilation, on the left, a child would learn what a dog is. Then they see some new four-legged creature and they call it a dog. This happens to be correct. We could refer to this as inductive reasoning. This is useful and encourages children in observation. Accommodation would occur when a child interacts with a new four-legged thing that is not a dog. In this example, a child calls a cat a dog simply because it has 4 legs. When they realize that the generalization cannot be made to all 4-legged things, accommodation is complete. An example in high school mathematics would be a proof. So, a proof is a logical argument that establishes beyond any doubt that something is true everywhere and for eternity. Unlike inductive reasoning, as in the previous slide, proofs require deductive reasoning. For deductive reasoning, you start from a general statement you know that for sure is true and draw conclusions about a specific case. For example, just keeping with the animal theme, if you know for a fact that all sheep like to eat grass, and you also know for a fact that the creature standing in front of you is a sheep, then you know that it must like to eat grass, for sure, most certainly. This form of reasoning is watertight. It can only go wrong if your premise is false. That is, if you're wrong about sheep liking grass, or if your observation is wrong and the creature you're looking at is not actually a sheep. But if those two things are correct, then your conclusion follows necessarily from your premise. It is true everywhere and for eternity. Mathematics is perhaps the only field in which absolute certainty is possible, which is why mathematicians hold proofs so dearly. Also, if we don't insist on proofs, mistakes can creep in that aren't easily spotted otherwise. If you want a real-life example of a mathematical proof that could not actually be proven, then look into Euclid's 5th postulate. High school emphasizes proofs in geometry as one of the first experiences a student has with deductive reasoning. Students often struggle with proofs, so researchers have tried to understand why through educational psychological studies. In a recent study in the International Education Studies Journal, they attempted to apply Piaget's ideas to students' errors. Researchers found one of the following was true in their study for students that were having problems with proofs. Number 1, either the student did not have the prior knowledge to assimilate or accommodate their understanding. Number 2, they did not realize that the previous knowledge could not be accommodated correctly, or there were unrelated errors. The conclusion that can be drawn from this research is that the failure of proof construction can occur due to either the incompleteness of the schema knowledge of students when they are attempting to assimilate, or the incomplete accommodation without sufficient reflection, or that they have a complete schema, but they're attempting to apply it erroneously to the new proof. In essence, they are overgeneralizing their understanding, or their schema, I guess. Another one of Piaget's contributions were the stages of cognitive development. The first 2 stages of cognitive development, sensory motor and pre-operational, I'm going to actually refrain from speaking about because they're not really relevant to this class, but certainly you can just look it up on you just Google it and you're going to get all kinds of stuff about the sensory motor stage and the pre-operational stage if you haven't already had this at some point in just a basic psychology class. But in terms of adolescence, I want to focus on the concrete operation stage and the formal operation stage. In the concrete operational stage is when thinking becomes much more logical. It can also be very rigid. Kids at this point in development tend to struggle with abstract and hypothetical concepts. Generally, students will enter the concrete operational stage when they're somewhere in the ages of 7 to 11 years, depending on biological factors, of course, right about the time that they're entering biological puberty. And these are the major characteristics and developmental changes. So during this stage, children begin to think logically about concrete events. They begin to understand the concept of conservation, that an amount and this is the famous experiment where you see a child that has 2 size glasses. They have a short glass and a tall glass, and they don't understand that if you pour the water from one glass into the other glass, the amount of water is conserved. So at this age, students should be able to understand that that the conservation exists. Their thinking becomes more logical and organized, but it's still very concrete. Children begin by using inductive logic or reasoning from specific information or a general principle. As they get a little bit older, they begin, so ages 12 and up, and I should say that these stages are not absolute. They are blurred. So it's not unusual for a student to be, entering formal operation stage, for example, and showing some of these characteristics when they're 13 or 14. It could just happen at any point. In the formal operational stage, adolescents or young adults begin to think abstractly and reason about hypothetical problems. The beginning of abstract thought begins to emerge. Teens think more about moral, philosophical, ethical, social, political issues that require theoretical and abstract reasoning, and they begin to use logic or reasoning from a general principle to more specific information. The criticisms in research finds that individual differences in cognitive abilities are not universal. Some researchers suggest that cognitive development is more continuous and less step-like than Piaget proposed, and that Piaget underestimated the skills of the subjects in each of the stages. Really, Piaget was focusing only on the thinking and the knowing, but yet missing other kinds of intelligence, such as emotional intelligence, etc. 6 new conceptual skills appear when formal operation thought occurs. The first skill is the capacity to mentally control more than 2 types of variables at the same time. An example of this is being able to think about the links which speed, distance, and time when planning a trip. The second skill is the capacity to think about modifications that might occur with time. For instance, they may grasp the concept that they will, in time, have to move from their parents' house into a new life of their own at one point in time. The next skill is the ability to imagine rational series of events. For example, they are capable of understanding how far they may go in college or afterwards, depending on how well they do in high school. The fourth skill is the capacity of predicting results of actions. An example of this is realizing that if they drink and drive, they might kill themselves or someone else. The next skill is the capacity to sense reasonable steadiness or contradictions in a set of statements. For instance, they may question equal education amongst different social classes. Finally, the last skill is the capability to think for themselves, others, and the world in a real way. Depending on social norms, children know they must act a certain way and know that others may act differently from them. There are several environmental factors which help to foster formal operational thought. The first condition is that children begin to process in various relationships that can conflict with one another. These roles may include son, daughter, student, friend, citizen, and dating partner. There may be expectations from different roles, and the pressures and stresses from these expectations may put a toll on the child. Another environmental condition is the child's membership in more heterogeneous group of peers, such as junior high or high school. Within these groups, there may be various social groups, ethnicities, religions, etc. Values and expectations are seen and realized as different from their peers. The last environmental experience that may promote formal operational thought is high school curriculum. The more complex, differentiated academic environment of the high school can bring substantial gains in conceptual skills for those students who become actively engaged in its academic programs. The various school subjects, such as math, science, language, fine arts, and humanities, help to teach the student to think of relationships logically, establish a theoretical deductive way of thinking, and promote notions of ways the world has been or may need to be. Now, as I mentioned, the full capabilities of using principles of logic unfold gradually, and so these aren't step-like. And not everyone will achieve formal operational skills by the time that they actually graduate. In fact, some studies estimate that 25 to 50% of college students have actually reached the developmental stage of formal operational thought. Also, keep in mind that social values and culture may also influence the achievement of these skills. Isolation, level of formal education of parents and of themselves, level of scientific sophistication in the community can all contribute to this. And of course, this is aligned with Piaget because we're really talking about schemas. So the students' ability to understand new concepts can only be as complete as the schema from which they are operating. In 1998, it suggested that only 35% of high school graduates in industrial countries obtain formal operations. And this was a study done by Hewitt and Hummel. And that, in fact, depending on their experiences, many people may not even begin to engage in deductive type reasoning formally during adulthood. This is significant in terms of developing instructional and performance support tools for students who are chronologically adults, but may be limited in their understanding of abstract concepts. For both adolescent and adult students, it's important to incorporate these instructional strategies. Use visual aids. Make sure students have either a concrete tool or a representational tool during discussions for their reference. They should be given opportunities to discuss social, political, and cultural issues in a safe space. And they should also be taught broad concepts rather than facts. So it's kind of the idea of what is the big question? What is the guiding question? What is the big idea? What is the rationale behind what they're learning? How will it be ultimately important? Another perspective or approach that is important to mention is called the information processing approach to cognitive development. So, as we've been discussing, the constructivist perspective, based on the work of Piaget and Dewey, takes the quantitative state of theory approach. Their approach hypothesizes that adolescents' cognitive improvement is relatively sudden and drastic. In the information processing perspective approach, it was actually originally derived from the study of artificial intelligence in computers and explains cognitive development in terms of the growth of specific components of the overall process of thinking. The development of computers in the 1950s and 60s had an important influence on psychology and was in part responsible for this approach and how it became a dominant approach in modern psychology, taking over a lot of the tenets of behaviorism. The computer gave cognitive psychologists a metaphor or analogy to which they could compare human mental processing. The use of computer as a tool for thinking and how human mind handles information is known as the computer analogy. Information processing theory discusses the mechanisms through which learning occurs. Specifically, it focuses on aspects of memory, encoding, and retrieval instead of just stimuli and response. As we spoke about in the last lecture, biological changes in brain structure and connectivity in the brain interact with increased experience, knowledge, and changing social demands to produce rapid cognitive growth. These changes generally begin at puberty or shortly thereafter, and some skills continue to develop as an adolescent ages. Development of executive functions or cognitive skills that enable the control and coordination of thoughts and behaviors are generally associated with the prefrontal cortex area of the brain. The thoughts, ideas, and concepts developed at this major period of life greatly influence one's future life and play a major role in character and personality formation. Improvements in basic thinking abilities generally occur in 5 areas during adolescence. Attention, which are seen as improvements in selective attention, the process by which one focuses on one stimulus while tuning out everything else, as well as divided attention, the ability to pay attention to 2 or more stimuli at the same time. The second area is memory. Memory is improvements are seen in both working memory and long-term memory. Processing speed. Adolescents think more quickly than children. Processing speed improves sharply between the ages of 5 and middle adolescence and levels off around age 15 and does not appear to change between late adolescence and adulthood. The next area is organization. Adolescents are more aware of their own thought processes and can use mnemonic devices and other strategies to think more efficiently. We see these a lot especially in the teaching of mathematics. Like you'll hear things like FOIL or PEMDAS instead of actually teaching the conceptual understanding behind order of operations and multiplication of polynomials. Metacognition is the last area where adolescents can think about the thinking themselves. This often involves monitoring one's own cognitive activity during the thinking process. Metacognition improves the ability to plan ahead, see the future consequences of actions, and provide alternative explanation for events. Metacognition can also be modeled by think alouds, expressing your own ideas with students. One thing in terms of attention, I will say that attention and memory, working memory, long-term memory, short-term memory even, is highly influenced by trauma. So if you have students that their parents are going through a divorce, there's violence in the home, there's uncertainty of where they're going to sleep that evening. I mean, there's other components that are much more survival-based, more than learning-based, that you will see. For many students, you'll impact on how their memory is working, and having students actually work with rote memorization or even just remember that they had an assignment in these kind of situations can be extraordinarily difficult for them. So the next person we're going to talk about is Lev Vygotsky. I'm sure if you've been in a teaching program for any level of time, you've heard about him. So he rejected the assumption made by Piaget that it was possible to separate learning from its social context. So he's known for the social cultural theory for that reason. Vygotsky's theories stress the fundamental role of social interaction in the development of cognition, as he believed strongly that community plays a central role in the process of making meaning. The emphasis is on a collaborative nature of learning and the importance of cultural and social context. All cognitive functions are believed to originate in and are explained as products of social interactions. Learning is more than the assimilation of new knowledge by learners. It was the process by which learners were integrated into a knowledge community. He believed that constructivists such as Piaget had overlooked the essentially social nature of language, and consequently failed to understand that learning is actually a collaborative process. In terms of main differences, Vygotsky places more emphasis on culture affecting cognitive development. Second, he places considerably more emphasis on social factors contributing to cognitive development. Vygotsky states that cognitive development stems from social interactions, from guided learning within the zone of proximal development, and that which is the space in which learning occurs, thus where teaching needs to be situated, as children and their partners co-construct knowledge. In contrast, Piaget maintained that cognitive development stems largely from independent explorations in which children construct knowledge of their own. Third, Vygotsky places more and different emphasis on the role of language in cognitive development. So the zone of proximal development is the space of potential learning. It can be defined as the distance between the actual developmental level as determined by independent problem solving and the level of potential development as determined through problem solving under guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. Vygotsky believed that when a student is in the zone of proximal development, or ZPD, for a particular task, provided the appropriate assistance will give the student enough of a boost to achieve the task. To assist a person to move through the zone of proximal development, educators are encouraged to focus on 3 important components which aid the learning process. First, there should be a presence of someone with knowledge and skills beyond that of the learner, so the more knowledgeable other. Second, social interactions with a skilled tutor that allow the learner to observe and practice their skills. And third, scaffolding or supportive activities provided by the educator or more competent peer to support the student as they are led through the zone of proximal development. When we're looking at cognitive psychology, really looking at the ideas of Piaget and Vygotsky, what's the best way to balance these? Do you take one versus another? In my opinion, I think what you do is you try different things. You give a mix of students being able to work independently, students being able to work in groups. I think in my opinion, and this is just my opinion at this point, all groups all the time is not always effective, and can sometimes, even if you have students that are more introverted, can cause even more stress to the point where they're feeling as though it might even prohibit their learning. So I think that in order to meet the needs of all our students, which is what we're constantly trying to do, I think when you're creating your lessons, when you're thinking about how you're going to present things, in my opinion, I would look sort of for the big idea, the rationale of why students need to learn what you want to teach them, and what things can be made available to the students that they can work independently, work in social groups, giving them choice, giving them support, allowing them to voice their beliefs either through writing, through paper. As we can see, you could even do it via video or a podcast or something. So bringing these together in a way that works for your students is really important. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. There is no absolute framework that will work for everybody. So I think that the blending of these and giving students exposure to this is really best. So next I want to talk about moral development. Really, it stems off of Kohlberg's theory. Traditionally, psychology has avoided studying anything that is loaded with value judgment because there's a degree of difficulty involved in trying to be unbiased about things that involve terms like good and bad. So one of the most significant aspects of human life, morality, has to wait quite a while before anybody in psychology even dared to touch it. But Lawrence Kohlberg wanted to study morality, and he did so using a most interesting but of course controversial technique. Basically, he would ask children and adults to try to solve moral dilemmas contained in little stories, and to do so out loud so he could follow their reasoning. It wasn't the specific answers to the dilemma that interested him, but rather how the person got his or her answer. One of the most famous of the stories concerned a man named Heinz. His wife was dying of a disease that could be cured if he could get a certain medicine. But when he asked the pharmacist, he was told that he could get the medicine, but it was only at a very high price, one that Heinz could not possibly afford. So the next evening, Heinz broke into the pharmacy and stole the drug to save his wife's life. Was Heinz right or wrong to steal the drug? There are simple reasons why Heinz should or should not have stolen the drug, and there are very sophisticated reasons, and reasons in between. After looking at hundreds of interviews using this and several other stories, Kohlberg outlined 3 broad levels and 6 more specific changes of moral development. Level 1 was pre-conventional morality. While infants are essentially amoral, very young children are moral in a rather primitive way, as described by the 2 pre-conventional stages. And I'll let you look those over, of infancy and preschool. Level 2 was conventional morality. By the time children enter elementary school, they're usually capable of conventional morality, although they may often slip back into conventional morality on occasion. But this level is called conventional for very good reason. It is also the level that most adults find themselves in most of the time. Stage 3, this stage is often called good boy, good girl stage. The child tries to live up to the expectations of others to seek their approval. Now they become interested in motives or intentions, and concepts such as loyalty, trust, and gratitude are understood. Children in this stage often adhere to a concrete version of the golden rule, although it is limited to the people they actually deal with on a day-to-day basis. Stage 4, this is called law and order stage. Children now take the point of view that includes a social system as a whole. The rules of society are the basis for right and wrong, and doing one's duty and showing respect for authority are important. Level 3 is the post-conventional morality stage. Some adolescents and adults go a step further and rise above moralities based on authority to ones based on reason. Stage 5, the social construct stage, means that being aware to the degree of to which much of the so-called morality is relative to the individual and the social group they belong to, and that only a very few fundamental values are universal. The person at this level sees morality as a matter of entering into a rational contract with one's fellow human beings to be kind to each other, respect authority, and follow laws to the extent that respect and promote those universal values. Social construct morality often involves a utilitarian approach, where the relative value of an act is determined by the greatest good for the greatest number. Stage 6, this stage is referred to the last stage of universal principles. At this point, the person is making a personal commitment to universal principles of equal rights and respect, and social contract takes a clear back seat. If there is a conflict between social law or custom and universal principles, the universal principle will take precedence. So an example of this would be actually from the movie Dark Knight. I don't know if you've seen the movie. The test is this. The Joker, the bad guy, rigs 2 ferry boats leaving the city with explosives and gives the passenger on each boat the trigger for the other boat. One boat contains average civilians, but the other contains prisoners, and therein lies the moral quandary. The Joker informs them that one of the boats must blow up the other before midnight, or he'll detonate both, killing them all. The Joker assumes it's inevitable that one of the boats will blow up the other, because he believes that most people are like him, only out for themselves. If you want to pause my video and watch it for yourself, I will add the link to the scene in the description box below. I can tell you Heath Ledger and Christian Bale do a much better job describing this scene than I would ever be able to do, so it's definitely worth the 4 minutes to watch it. There are several characters to consider here. There's the boats of commuters, which include the captain, the male passengers, the mother, along with everybody else on the boat. There's also the boat of felons, which include the guards, the warden, the prisoners, and one specific prisoner that stays quiet most of the time. At the end of the scene, it takes a somewhat happy ending. Not happy in circumstance necessarily, but happy that in posits humanity actually exists. Though it looks for a moment like the passenger will turn on another, a prisoner, played by actor Tom Lister, takes a detonator from the prison warden and throws it out the window into the river. Or the ocean, or wherever they are. He doesn't flinch or think about it for a second, only telling the warden before throwing it, "I'll do what you should have done 10 minutes ago." Likewise, a civilian on the other boat who is about to pull the trigger decides against it. As Batman tells the Joker, this city just proved that it's full of people ready to believe in good. Social learning theory is related to Vygotsky's social development theory and also Kohlberg's moral development theories. Social learning theory was theorized by Albert Bandura, and he posited that people learn from one another through observation, imitation, and modeling. The theory has been called a bridge between behaviorist and cognitive learning theories because it encompasses attention, memory, and motivation, etc. Morality is rooted in self-regulation and not abstract reasoning. The theory also emphasizes the importance of social learning. Bandura believed in reciprocal determinism, that is, the world and the person's behavior cause each other, while behaviorism essentially states that one's environment causes one's behavior. Bandura, who was studying adolescent aggression, found this too simplistic, and so in addition he suggested that behavior causes environment as well. Later, Bandura soon considered personality as an interaction between these components, the environment, behavior, and one's psychological processes, or one's ability to entertain images in minds and language. In summary, moral development is influenced by society and environment, so it cannot be placed into universal stages. The influence of society is too variable to produce these uniform types. The moral self is developed by adopting standards that regulate their actions. The standards serve as guides for right and wrong, and so self-regulation is dependent on those moral standards one chooses to adopt. One of his most famous experiments, Bobo doll, suggested that aggression can be modeled. When children, and these were not adolescents, these were actually children in the original experiment, were shown videos of adults playing with a Bobo doll. And a Bobo doll, I have a cartoon version of the Bobo doll on the PowerPoint, or one of those dolls that rock back and forth, and they're weighted so they can't ever fall. They'll just keep bouncing back up. Children were divided into two groups. One group of children were shown videos of adults playing nicely with the dolls, just moving them around, things like that, not hitting them. Another group of children were showed videos where the adults were acting violently towards the dolls. In other words, hitting them, punching them, throwing them. When the children were allowed to play alone with the dolls themselves, they reproduced the behaviors they had seen on videos. Therefore, there were more aggressive actions taken against the doll by children that had seen an adult acting aggressively towards the doll instead of playing nicely. This experiment was somewhat reproduced with video games and violent movies, but has shown mixed results in acts leading to aggression in real life. You might have heard about those. They come up every once in a while. Finally, our key takeaways for this lecture is, as teachers, the understanding of cognitive psychology helps us make the content material accessible to students. Also, as teachers, the understanding of moral development helps us understand choices students make within the class.